Greetings. My name is Dr. Arafat Faili. I'm a medical oncologist here at the American University of Beirut, and I'll be giving you today a lecture about an introduction to anemia, essentially the way our general approach for the management of patients with anemia. And then this lecture will be followed by a series of other lectures where they deal with specific types of anemia, including iron deficiency, B12, and so on. So the learning outcomes from this presentation are to get familiar with anemia and its signs and symptoms, learn the general approach to patients with anemia, and get introduced to the workup of patients with anemia. And this is the outline of the presentation. We start with the definition of anemia, its signs and symptoms, and finally with the approach to a patient with anemia, including history taking, physical examination, and laboratory evaluation. So, definition of anemia. Anemia is simply defined as a blood hemoglobin or hematocrit level below what's appropriate for the reference range for that patient. And this is, as you can see, it's not a very precise definition, simply because what is the appropriate reference range for that patient? We don't know what the appropriate reference range for that patient. And as a background, for us in medicine in general, to decide what is an appropriate reference range, let's say I want to measure the sodium level in a patient. How do I decide this sodium level is normal or not? So what do? Is we bring, let's say, 100 patients, not patients, 100 healthy people, and measure their sodium level, and you end up with a range. Some people have a sodium level of 130, some have 135, some are 140, and so on. And the typical distribution of this range is the typical Bell distribution of a curve. So most of the time, most of the people are close to the mean, but you see some variation, less or more around that mean. So the normal range is usually decided for anything in general in medicine is the 95% confidence interval. So any value that falls within the 95%, the middle 95% of these people. So automatically you have 2.5% of the people are below that range and 2.5% of people are above that range. These are healthy people with normal sodium or normal whatever level, but simply because of the matter of definition, they fall outside that range. So, an anemia is any value that falls below that appropriate range for that patient. And the reason we mention for that patient, because there are different ranges for different people. For example, males have a different normal value than females. Usually males tend to have a higher hemoglobin and hematocrit level compared to females. Children have a different definition than adults, again because of the change of the normal range over age. For practical definitions, usually it's defined as a hemoglobin level below 14 for males and adult males, and below 12 for adult females. And really, as I mentioned, it varies with age, with the gender, and so on. This definition has several problems, really. As I mentioned initially, of the normal population, 2.5% for the people will have a hemoglobin level below the defined normal range, and 2.5 will have above the normal range. So these 2.5 will be automatically classified as anemic patients, even though they're perfectly healthy people with no problem in their hematopoietic system. The definition also ignores multiple physiologic variables. For example, there are some variants of hemoglobin that have a different affinity for oxygen. So there are some hemoglobin variants that have a low oxygen affinity, so they release the oxygen more readily to the tissues, so you don't need that much hemoglobin to release enough tissue to the tissues. So these people have a low hemoglobin level, but the oxygen delivery system to the tissues is perfectly fine. So even though they are classified as anemic people, but there's no problem with the oxygenation of the tissues. A second problem is the hemoglobin level does not change with acute blood loss. For example, let's say somebody got a gunshot wound, and a bullet hit an artery on that person, and acutely they lose 1 or 2 liters of blood. When these people present to the emergency room acutely within the first hour or so, and you measure the hemoglobin and hematocrit level on these, you end up with a normal value. And the main reason is because the blood loss is not only red blood cell loss, it's red blood cells and plasma and so on. So you're losing whole blood. So the concentration of the hemoglobin and the hematocrit in the blood remains the same because you're losing whole blood. It's only after several hours when the body adjusts and the fluid gets sucked into the intravascular space to compensate for the blood loss. This is when the red blood cells get diluted and you see some drop in the hemoglobin and hematocrit. So therefore, somebody comes to you with an acute blood loss, a bleeding ulcer acutely, or a gunshot wound or anything, and you measure a hemoglobin hematocrit on them acutely, don't be fooled. This value will likely drop a lot in the next few hours with the better reorganization of the body fluids. And another limit is the hemoglobin level does not always reflect the true red blood cell mass. Really what we care about in the body is the red blood cell mass, how much RBCs I have to deliver the oxygen to my tissues. The best example I think for that is during pregnancy. So during pregnancy, the pregnant woman, the red blood cell mass expands, but at the same time the plasma expands to a larger extent. So even though we have more red blood cells, but the plasma expands even more. So you get a lower hemoglobin hematocrit level because of the expansion of the plasma. So pregnant women automatically have anemia, their hemoglobin hematocrit levels go down, but the red blood cell mass is high. The opposite happens with athletes. So athletes, from the chronic and heavy exercise they have, the plasma volume decreases. So you measure their hemoglobin and hematocrit, they have a high hemoglobin hematocrit simply because of the small plasma volume. You hear me hearing about hemoglobin and hematocrit. What's the difference between hemoglobin and hematocrit? Hemoglobin essentially is a measurement of the hemoglobin, the protein, hemoglobin concentration in the blood. So how much I have of hemoglobin per deciliter of blood. The hematocrit is the percentage of the blood volume occupied by RBCs. So notice it's a percentage. It doesn't have a unit. It doesn't have a gram or milligram next to it. It's a percentage of the blood occupied by RBCs. So for every liter of blood, let's say I have 1 liter of blood, I have 400 cc's of red cells. The hematocrit is simply 400 over 1000 is 40. And this is how we measure it. In fact, really, the easiest way to measure somebody's hematocrit, you draw blood, put it in a tube, let that tube stand vertically for an hour or so. The red blood cells will precipitate at the bottom, and you can measure how much there's a red color and how much there is a yellow color on top. The percentage of red over the whole volume is the hematocrit. You don't need any machine for it. Okay. Another important issue is the anemia. Is not a diagnosis by itself. The anemia is a laboratory abnormality that needs investigation. So we don't. It's not like diabetes. So when you have anemia, you need to work it up to see why the patient has anemia. What's the disease entity that led to that anemia? Signs and symptoms of anemia. So think physiologically. When you have a low hemoglobin and hematocrit levels in the blood, you have less oxygen delivery to the tissues. So every organ has a different way of expressing the low oxygen that's receiving. For example, brain, so maybe some headache, some dizziness, some inability to concentrate. These are the usual symptoms. heart, when you have low oxygen delivery, what does the heart do? The heart is going to have to work harder to pump a larger volume of blood. When you have fewer RBCs around, the heart will have to pump a larger volume to increase the cardiac output in order to compensate for that. So on the heart, you see a rapid heart rate, that's what we call tachycardia, palpitations, and what we call dyspnea on exertion, meaning the patient gets short of breath with minimal activity. Okay, lungs, shortness of breath, dyspnea on exertion. Muscles, you feel like muscle fatigue and lack of energy in the muscle, and so on and so on. And there are these symptoms vary a lot according to, most importantly, the degree of the anemia, and I think more importantly the acuity of development of the anemia. Okay, so the lower the hemoglobin, the more likely the patient is to have symptoms. But I think the more important aspect is how acute that process is happening. Okay? I still remember I was in your seats. I mean, I was a medical student. I was a fourth-year medical student applying for a residency position. I was doing the interview at one of the university hospitals in the US, and then the program director comes to me. He said, "Do you know why I like AUB graduates?" I told him why. He said, "Let me tell you about this incident that happened last year." So they were doing the interviews, and during the interview, they take the interviewees for something called morning report, where it's essentially a morning meeting where one of the residents presents a challenging case, and they discuss the signs and symptoms, workup, and so on, and the management. And that case was the patient had anemia. And the program director asked everybody in the room, he said, at what hemoglobin level it is appropriate to transfuse the patient? So some patients said, some residents said hemoglobin 7, some said hemoglobin 6 or 8, and so on. And there was a student from AUB during the interviews. He said it all depends on the acuity, on the symptomatology. So a hemoglobin level of 10 in a 25-year-old person is very different than a hemoglobin level of 10 in a 75-year-old gentleman with heart disease. So you're much more likely to have problems from that in the older person than in the younger person. And also on the acuity. A hemoglobin level of 10, somebody who's chronically anemic might feel nothing, while somebody who's perfectly healthy with a hemoglobin of 14 and then suddenly loses blood from a bleeding ulcer down to a hemoglobin of 10, they will be very symptomatic. So really it depends on the level, on the comorbid conditions, and the acuity of the presentation. And very important, when the anemia develops very slowly, there are many mechanisms where the body tries to minimize the symptomatology from it. One of the famous mechanisms is the increased level of 2,3-DPG. This is from the glycolytic pathway, and I'll mention this in the next couple of slides. But essentially, when you have a chronic anemia, there are higher levels of 2,3-DPG, which shifts the oxygen dissociation curve and minimizes symptoms from the anemia. And you can see it over here. This is the typical oxygen dissociation curve. This is what you see in the black line. There are many scenarios where that curve is shifted to the right or to the left. And you can see on the green line, this is what we call shifting of the curve to the right. Anytime you have hypoxia or any acidotic scenario like increased CO2 or decreased pH or increased 2,3-DPG, the dissociation curve shifts to the right, meaning the hemoglobin releases oxygen more readily to the tissues. And the opposite happens to the left. When you have less CO2, higher pH, the curve shifts to the left. Other factors that affect the symptomatology, as I mentioned, younger age, so the children tolerate low hemoglobin levels much more remarkably than older people. In fact, in the older people, sometimes the first sign of symptoms is what we call angina, a chest pain. If they have significant coronary artery disease, they might present with chest pain because of the anemia. For physical symptoms, again, you can go really organ by organ. So it might include a pallor, the patient looks pale, tachycardia, increased heart rate, increased cardiac impulse, and what we call sometimes a systolic flow murmur. This is essentially a murmur in the heart, simply because the heart is pumping a larger volume of blood per minute, so the cardiac output is higher for the same size of the valve. So the larger volume has to go through the valve. You might end up with something called a flow murmur. This is not a pathologic murmur. It's simply because you have a larger volume of fluid going through the same surface area. Best way to look for pallor, don't look at the skin color, because many times, especially people with darker skin color, you cannot notice the skin color. It's best to look in the conjunctiva or under the nail beds and the palmar creases. This is where you see the pallor best. Another important aspect is that most of the hospitals, you can see maybe the wall behind me is yellowish. Most of the exam hospitals have a yellowish paint, and so you are more likely to notice some yellowish discoloration in the conjunctiva because there's yellow color around you. So make sure you have a proper sunlight, proper lighting to look for yellowish discoloration or pallor in the conjunctiva. How do you approach patient with anemia, the general approach? And I think anemia is one of the entities where the history and physical exam are probably the most important. I mean, probably you can diagnose more than 80% of anemia patients simply by proper history and physical exam. And there are really so many questions that you can ask that can help you. For example, ask about the onset of the symptoms. Is it insidious or abrupt? Because if the patient tells you, I was perfectly fine last week, and right now I'm so fatigued, I'm very pale, I cannot breathe, and so on, this is a very acute process. Usually acute processes are not due to nutritional deficiencies. Usually nutritional deficiencies are very slow to develop. So the onset is very insidious. You can see the hemoglobin and hematocrit dropping months after months after months if you have B12 or folate or iron deficiency. While if you have a bleeding or hemolysis, meaning destruction of the RBCs, the process is more likely to be abrupt. Ask about the duration of the symptoms. Again, the longer the duration, the more likely nutrition deficiencies are there, and the less likely acute bleeding is there. Very important question is previous blood count. CBC stands for complete blood count. This is the basic test that will look for the hemoglobin, hematocrit level, the white cells, the size of the RBCs, the platelet count is called complete blood count. And it helps, really, it helps a lot if the patient had any prior CBCs. For example, if the patient has always had this anemia and has always had this low MCV, for example, you start thinking this is something hereditary or some enzyme deficiency that led to that. While the patient, if the patient had a perfectly normal CBC a couple of years back, and now we have a abnormal blood count and the hemoglobin is going down, this is not something hereditary. This is something acquired that happened in the past couple of years, and so on. Always ask about previous diagnosis of anemia. And did anybody tell you you have anemia in the past? Very likely you will be hearing the answer, no, nobody told me that. But it does not mean they did not have anemia. Did they tell you your blood count is normal, or they did not mention? Because many times when you have a slightly low hemoglobin level, the doctors do not mention it. It does not mean there was no anemia. So that's why it's important to look at the CBC by itself to see if there was any anemia. But sometimes they tell you, yes, I had anemia and I took some iron and got better. So this tells you maybe there was some element of iron deficiency and so on. Again, ask about if they received any iron, folate, or B12 treatment. Unfortunately, there's a common practice in our region is when somebody is diagnosed with anemia, they get prescribed iron without any proper testing. This is too risky. Just to give you an example, there are two types of anemia that cause what we call the microcytic anemias, anemias with small red cells. The two major causes are iron deficiency and thalassemia in our area. Okay, and they both present with anemia with low MCV, low mean corpuscular volume. Okay, so if the patient has iron deficiency, fine, you can give them anemia. But if they have thalassemia, it's contraindicated to give them iron. On the contrary, they usually have a very high iron levels. So it's too risky to give them that. So it is important when you see this anemia to test for the cause rather than treating empirically, because you might do more harm than benefit on these patients. Okay. Ask about the family history of anemia. Again, if there are multiple family members with the same type of anemia, you start thinking about inherited hemoglobinopathies or some of the hereditary disorders, which you can learn about during this course. Change in bowel habits. Most importantly, ask for the color of the stools. Is it black? And black meaning completely black, not dark stools, because all the blood in the stools turns black. This is what we call melena. Be careful also, patients who are taking iron supplementations, because iron itself is black, they can have black stools. So if they tell you I have black stools, check if they're taking any oral iron supplementation. If they have red blood in the stools, that's what we call hematochezia, this speaks very much more acute absorption, bleeding problem. Diet, very important question. This is all within the history. We have not touched the patient yet. Because, for example, people who are vegans or vegetarians, they don't eat meat. Meat is the main source of iron, so if they're much more likely to have iron deficiency. And again, dairy products, fresh fruits and vegetables, they are very important sources of folates and B12. So if they don't eat these, they're more likely to have folate and B12 deficiency. Ask about medications. There are multiple medications that do interfere with folate metabolism, like sulfa drugs and so on. And there are other mechanisms that interfere with absorption of other medications. Okay. Ask about past medical history. There are an entity called anemia of chronic disease, somebody who has, for example, rheumatoid arthritis all their life, or they have active coronary artery disease. Many of them, they have a chronic hemoglobin level of around 10. This is what we call a anemia of chronic disease. Alcohol consumption, very important. Patients who are alcoholics, there are several ways where alcohol can cause anemia. First, it can affect the liver, so liver dysfunction can give you anemia. It can suppress the bone marrow, what's called myelodysplasia, essentially a dysfunctional bone marrow. Alcoholic patients are usually, they have poor nutrition status, they are likely to get multiple vitamin deficiency, which can cause also anemia. So there are several ways alcohol consumption can cause anemia. Menstrual history, very, very important. So in menstruating women, ask about the frequency of the period and how many days and how heavy it is. And you have to be detailed. You ask how many pads, if there were any clots or so on. Because if you ask how many, do you have a normal period? Some have a period for 10 days and think this is normal. So ask how many days and how many days are heavy and so on. Reproductive history, specifically pregnancy, because during pregnancy women lose a lot of iron. There are two ways of losing iron. A good amount of the iron gets transferred from the mother's hemoglobin to the fetus hemoglobin. The fetal hemoglobin has better affinity for iron, so they suck the iron from the mother's blood. And the second mechanism is during the delivery by itself, there is a lot of blood loss. So pregnant women, it's estimated with every pregnancy, women lose around 1 gram of iron, which is a sizable amount of iron. So always check about the reproductive history and the frequency of pregnancies. Occupational history, some people who work in a lot with organic solvents and hydrocarbons, they can have a toxic exposure on the bone marrow that affects hemoglobin exposure, hemoglobin production. And also ask for jaundice or dark urine. Did you notice any change in your skin color or the urine color as a sign or symptom of hemolysis? Weight loss, very, very important question. I remember we had a patient, really a woman in her 60s. She had the typical iron deficiency anemia, and the only clue that we had is that she had lost 10 kilograms. When you see weight loss, take it very seriously. There is something beyond simple iron deficiency. That woman ended up with colon cancer. So when you already see significant weight loss, unintentional weight loss, take it very seriously. Fever, night sweats. There are some malignancies like lymphomas and so on can cause fever and night sweat, and they can be associated with anemias. Abdominal discomfort or fullness, a sign or symptoms of enlarged spleen or enlarged liver. They can have abdominal discomfort or fullness. Sores in the mouth and the tongue. I'm going to show you some of the pictures. It's very common when you have B12 or folate deficiency to have these sores in the mouth. And paresthesias, clumsiness, and weakness, essentially neurologic symptoms, is a very common also abnormality in B12 deficiency. When it comes to physical examination, really go organ by organ. So with the general appearance, look for pallor, for jaundice, again in the conjunctiva, and look for enlarged thyroid for thyroid problems. Look for what we call spider angiomas. This is essentially dilated angiomata, dilated blood vessels in the skin as a sign of liver disease. Spoon nails. This is, I'm going to show you a picture of that. Spoon nail is a common symptom in iron deficiency. In the eye examination, look for icterus in the sclera due to hemolysis and retinal hemorrhage that can happen with iron deficiency and others. Head and neck, examine the tongue. Glossitis is a common problem with B12 and folate deficiency, what we call angular stomatitis. I'm going to show you some pictures in the next few slides on that. That's also common in megaloblastic anemias. Cardiac, listen for murmurs. It could be just a simple flow murmur that we spoke about, but there could be a sign of endocarditis and bacterial vegetations on the valve that can present with anemia. The abdomen, feel for the spleen, feel for the liver, because many of these anemias are associated with hepatosplenomegaly. Lymphatic system, fear for cervical lymph nodes, particular axillary inguinal lymph nodes. Again, it's common with lymphoma and they can present with anemia. And nervous system, as I mentioned before, neuropathy, cerebellar symptoms, they could be the earliest signs of B12 deficiency. Even before anemia develops, they can have this. So I'm going to share with you some of the really common signs that you see on physical examination. So to the left of the slide, you see the general symptoms: headaches, shortness of breath, palpitations, confusion, weakness. To the right, some specific signs that I'll show you one by one. So this is essentially where you look for pallor. Look on the lower aspect of the conjunctiva, and look for pallor and for icterus, meaning yellowish discoloration as a sign of hemolysis and so on. This is a typical appearance of what we call a spoon nail that you see with iron deficiency anemia. This is an inflamed tongue. This is what we call glossitis, a common problem in B12 and folate deficiency. The redness that you see at the ankles of the mouth, this is what we call angular stomatitis, also a common symptoms in B12 deficiency. This is an X-ray, a lateral view of the neck. So as if you're looking at the neck from the side. So you see the vertebral bottom, vertebral column. The white stuff is essentially the patient swallowing barium, which is a whitish material. This is what we call a barium swallow. And you can see there is, at the arrows, there is a black thing. This is what's called esophageal web. And with esophageal web, it's very common to have iron deficiency. It's a syndrome called the Plummer-Vinson syndrome. You don't need to remember it, but essentially esophageal webs are associated with iron deficiency anemia. Lower extremity swelling, this is what we call edema. It's not specific for anemia. Anemia causes it, but there are many other entities, heart problems, liver problems, kidney diseases, all of these that can cause varices in the lower extremities. All of these can cause lower extremity swelling. High flow murmur in the heart, this is what we call a flow murmur because of the high cardiac output. When it comes to laboratory testing, so really, some very basic tests that can answer many of the questions we need to answer about anemia. Start with what's called CBC. A CBC is a complete blood count. It essentially gives you the white cell count, the hemoglobin, the hematocrit, the MCV, which is the mean corpuscular volume. This is the size, the average size of the red cells. Some other entities, but importantly also the platelet count. So what the CBC tells you, first, is this a pure anemia, red cell problem, or if this includes the white cells or the platelets? When you see more than one line involved, see the white cells, the red cells, and the platelets involved, you start thinking this is likely a bone marrow problem, or production problem, because it's more than one line. It's not a purely red blood cell problem. Also, very importantly, look at the MCV, the size of their cells, and you can see in the next few slides we classify anemias according to the MCV, low, normal, or high MCV, and the differential diagnosis is so different, depends on that MCV. Very importantly is to do a very well made peripheral smear. Very simple, a drop of blood put in a slide, and laboratory technician looks at it under the microscope. There is so many information you can get from that. I'll show you some slides on it. Okay. Other chemistries including creatinine to measure the kidney function, the liver enzymes to look for liver dysfunction, calcium, some disease entities like myeloma and others that can elevate the calcium. The bilirubin, which is if you have any hemolysis, the bilirubin goes up. LDH, lactate dehydrogenase, very important test for hemolysis. We're going to talk a lot about this in the hemolytic anemia lecture and so on. The reticulocyte count, really very important, and as you know, the reticulocytes are the youngest RBCs. So as soon as the RBC is released from the bone marrow to the blood, it takes around 1 day to mature. It's one day it's called the reticulocyte, and the reticulocyte count gives you a lot of ideas, a lot of information about how active the bone marrow is. When you have a high reticulocyte count, this means the bone marrow is active in trying to compensate for that anemia. When you have a low reticulocyte count with anemia, this tells you there's a production problem. The bone marrow is not able to produce enough red blood cells, and so on. So additional tests, including iron studies, depends really, you decide what your differential diagnosis is. So I see it all the time in the hospital. Somebody with anemia, they order iron, B12, and folate. This is not appropriate. Iron deficiency has low MCV. So when you have a low, what we call microcytic anemia, it's reasonable to test for the iron stores and so on. When you have a high MCV, this is when you test for B12 and folate, because these anemias are usually what we call macrocytic anemias and so on. So really, it depends a lot on the MCV and so on. Okay. This is a typical appearance of a perfectly normal peripheral smear. So you can see, if you look at the red blood cells, really very well rounded, very little variation in the size. So on the CBC, there's an entity called RDW, red cell distribution width, meaning how much variation there is in the size of the red blood cells. The more variation, the more active the bone marrow. So normally you see very little variation, very low RDW. Okay. Typically in iron deficiency, you see a high RDW. I'll show you some of the slides. But look at the red cells, very well rounded, almost very similar size. A gross way of estimating, is this a normal size or not? Look at the lymphocyte at the upper right-hand corner of the smear. So the normal RBC usually is the size of the nucleus of a lymphocyte. Okay, if it's much smaller, you can compare it to a lymphocyte. Okay? Another important entity in the shape of the red cells is the central pallor. As you know, the RBCs are biconcave, just to expand the surface area for better oxygen exchange. Because of this biconcave shape, there is a central pallor where in the center of the red cells there is less hemoglobin. So that's why under the peripheral smear they look like this. Most of the hemoglobin is at the periphery, and the center there is some central pallor. Normally, the central pallor should be less than half of the diameter of the RBC. So you can see in there it's occupying probably 1/3, a little bit more 1/3. It should be less than half of the diameter of the RBCs. So this is really perfect. And you can on the black arrows there are some platelets in there. Otherwise, it looks a perfectly normal smear. On the other hand, this is a peripheral smear with iron deficiency anemia. Look at the central pallor. You see how much most of the RBC is, the pallor is occupying most of the RBC because there is very little hemoglobin inside the RBC. Look at the variation in the size of the cells. Some are big, some are small. You see a lot of variation. This is high RDW, red cell distribution width, typical of iron deficiency anemia. And you can see some abnormal red cells like this one and this one. This is what we call pencil cells, which is also typical of iron deficiency anemia. In thalassemia, so this is the other entity. You can have a lecture on thalassemia, but this is the other entity that has microcytic anemia, has a low MCV. Very similarly, you see the central pallor is expanded, but you see little variation in the size. So the RDW is normal, is not elevated. So this is one important factor. So between anemia, iron deficiency, and thalassemia, iron deficiency anemia, you have microcytic anemia but high RDW, while in thalassemia it has a normal RDW. Very important entity with thalassemia is what you see here at the arrow, is what's called a target cell. Instead of having a central pallor, you see in the center some more hemoglobin concentrated because of the abnormal shape of the red cells. This is what to call, it's just like a target. They call it a target cell. Another important entity you can see here on the smear, the black dots on the upper right hand corner, these are what you call nucleated red cells. So as you know, normally the red cells mature and they shed the nucleus while they're still in the bone marrow. So when they get released into the blood, they have lost their nucleus and they've lost their DNA. Sometimes when you have a very active bone marrow, you see the bone marrow sheds these RBCs too soon. You see some nucleated red cells in the blood. Normally, when they go into the spleen, the spleen gets rid of these nuclei. So you don't see a lot of nucleated red cells when you have a very active spleen. Somebody who had a splenectomy, you're very likely to see nucleated red cells because these are not destroyed in the spleen. This is a neutrophil. Usually in neutrophils, the nucleus has few lobes, 4 or 5 lobes. When you see many lobes, this is what we call hypersegmented neutrophil. This is a typical finding in B12 deficiency. In here, you see, look at the abnormal shape of the cells, and the arrows on the blue arrows, they look like a sickle, mantle, and so this is typical of sickle cell disease. And sometimes you completely lose the central pallor. So instead of having the biconcave shape, they have a spherical shape. This is what we see in spherocytosis. So I briefly mentioned the reticulocyte count. The reticulocyte count is a very, very important test that we do, and essentially it helps us decide, is this a production problem or a destruction problem? So the reticulocytes are the youngest RBCs. As soon as they get released from the bone marrow, they still have some RNAs. That's why it appears as reticulin, a little bit more bluish hue on the peripheral smear, and they usually last for 1 day. We know a reticulocyte is 1 day, and then it becomes a completely mature RBC and becomes like any other RBCs. So normally, as I mentioned, the reticulocyte normal survival is for 1 day. The RBCs the mature RBCs, the normal survival is 100 to 120 days. So for simplicity, let's say it's 100 days. So in the normal steady state, the reticulocyte survives for 1 day, the RBC survives for 100 days. So a normal reticulocyte count as a percentage is 1%, because it lasts for 1 day, and the mature RBCs last for 100 days. So when you measure the reticulocyte count as a percentage of the red cells, it's 1%. This is the normal steady state. Okay? But sometimes you see a lot of variation if the patient has anemia or a patient has a very active bone marrow. The reticulocyte count varies, and so we have to measure. We have different ways of measuring that. Okay, but as a general rule, when the reticulocyte count increases, this means there's an active bone marrow trying to make up for the anemia. When you have a low reticulocyte count with anemia, this tells you there's a production problem, because the anemia is not doing, the bone marrow is not doing its job. Okay. So how do we correct for so many variables in there? When the bone marrow is trying to work harder and cover to correct for the anemia, it makes more reticulocyte. But it's not only that, it starts to release the reticulocytes sooner. A good example of that, let's say in World War II. When World War II started in 1939, the soldiers were 18 and older. Okay? But as the war progressed, 1940, 41, 42, and the countries lost a lot of their soldiers, they started to recruit younger, 16 and 17-year-old kids rather than 18, because they need the soldiers. And this is a very similar example. It happens very similar in the bone marrow. So normally the bone marrow, if you look at the top horizontal bar, this is the normal lifespan of a reticulocyte. Usually, in a steady state with somebody with no anemia, the reticulocyte spends 3.5 days in the bone marrow, gets released, and spends 1 day in the peripheral blood. Okay, this is with a normal hematocrit of 45. Patients who are anemic, when the hemoglobin drops to 35, okay, the bone marrow starts to make more reticulocyte, but not only that, it starts to release the reticulocytes sooner. So instead of spending 3.5 days in the bone marrow, they spend 3 days. And instead of spending 1 day in the blood, they spend 1.5 days. This is what we call reticulocyte shift. So the worse the anemia, the sooner the reticulocytes are released. So automatically, these, for the same number of reticulocytes, they're going to last longer in the blood. Instead of lasting 1 day, they will last 2.5 days, for example, 2.5 days. And this is something you need, when you're looking at the reticulocyte count, you need to keep in mind, because as you mentioned, normally the reticulocyte count as a percentage is 1%. But if the reticulocytes are getting released sooner, they will automatically be 2 or 2.5%, because they're spending more time in the blood. So all of these need to be taken into consideration when measuring the reticulocytes. And we have several ways of measuring the reticulocyte count. Number one is, as I mentioned, the reticulocyte percentage. What percentage of the cells, what percentage of the red cells is reticulocytes? Normally 1%. Let's say, I like to give an example, you might have noticed that. Let's say in your class right now, you have around 100 students in your class. And you have one student with green eyes. So if you ask what percentage of your class has green eyes, it's 1%, 1 out of 100. In the same class, so let's say 50 of these students leave the classroom, and the person with the green eyes is still in the classroom. And you ask what percentage of the students have green eyes, it's now 2%, because it's 1 out of 50 rather than 1 out of 100. For the same number of people with green eyes, the percentage goes up because the denominator has changed from 100 to 50. And the same happens here with reticulocytes. So for the same number of reticulocytes, if you have anemia, the percentage of reticulocytes goes up because you have less mature RBCs. So in anemia, the reticulocyte count percentage is falsely elevated because you have less mature RBCs. Okay, so as a way to look into it, you can do what's called the absolute reticulocyte count. Rather than the percentage, you look at the number, the actual number of the reticulocytes, 50,000, 75,000, and so on. Okay, and we can do also what's called corrected reticulocyte count. You can correct for the anemia. So how do you correct for it? It's the percentage of reticulocytes times the patient's hematocrit over normal hematocrit. Patient's hematocrit over 45. Okay, so when you correct for the anemia, you avoid that. I don't want to call it wrong, but just abnormal reassurance that your reticulocyte is fine. Again, so instead of doing one person with a green eye over 50, you have to correct for that. You have to multiply that number by half, 50 over 100, to correct for the loss of the other 50 students. The same, so when you have the same corrected reticulocyte count, you multiply by the patient's hematocrit over the normal hematocrit, you correct for that anemia. The other thing you need to correct for is the reticulocyte shift, again, that we mentioned in the previous slide. So from the earlier release, if the reticulocyte is spending more time in the bone, in the peripheral blood, it's going to count more because it's lasting longer, essentially. So the most accurate measurement of the reticulocyte is called the reticulocyte production index. What's the reticulocyte production index? It's called RPI. Is the actual percentage of reticulocytes, that's the test that we got in the simply from the lab, okay, times the patient's hematocrit over 45. This is how to correct for the anemia. Sorry, you correct for the anemia times the 1 over reticulocyte maturation time. So meaning you have to correct for the anemia, and you have to correct how much the reticulocyte spends in the blood. So RPI is the reticulocyte percentage times the patient's hematocrit over normal hematocrit times 1 over the maturation time, reticulocyte maturation time. And the actual reticulocyte maturation time is the one I showed you in the previous slides. It's 1 for a hematocrit of 45, 2 for a hematocrit of 25, 2.5 hematocrit 15, and so on. When it comes to differential diagnosis of anemia, really you can think about it in two aspects, either in terms of pathophysiology or in terms of morphology. Pathophysiology, really 3 mechanisms of causing anemia: either a production problem, or you're not making enough cells, or you're losing cells, either through hemolysis or bleeding. So really simple pathophysiology is blood loss, decreased production, or increased destruction. Okay. On the other way of, you can look at it by morphology, as I told you, look at the MCV, low MCV, normal MCV, high MCV. Low MCV, we call it microcytic anemias, normal we call it normocytic anemias, and high we call it macrocytic anemias. And when you look at this, either kinetic approach or the MCV, you end up with a wide differential. You don't need, of course, you don't need to remember this table, but it essentially narrows down your differential diagnosis about the cause of the anemia. And this is essentially, you have anemic. First, look at the reticulocyte index. So if you have an adequate reticulocyte index, a high reticulocyte count, meaning the bone marrow is active, this is what we call a hyper-regenerative bone marrow. This tells you you're losing red cells after production. So there is either hemolysis, destruction, or bleeding. If you have a low reticulocyte index, this is what we call a hypo-regenerative bone marrow, meaning you have a production problem. Look for nutritional deficiencies or bone marrow disorders, and so on. And when you have underproduction, you can look at the MCV, microcytic, normocytic, or macrocytic. And then under each of these, there are several entities. You don't need to remember these, but under microcytic anemias, you have a differential, and normocytic anemias, you have a differential, and macrocytic anemias, you have a differential, and so on. And again, when you have increased destruction, we can have a specific lecture on that, about hemolysis with the high LDH and so on. I think this is my last slide, and I would really be happy to answer any questions that you have. Please email me if you have any.